And it's no surprise that autoimmune diseases, which women are way more prone to anyway, they surface during the 3 Ps. So during puberty, during pregnancy, and during perimenopause. As those hormones start to shift, we can see that there's an elevation in potential for autoimmune. So, if you've got a family history of them, then those are the 3 periods in a woman's life where you might start to see those things happen.
Welcome back to the Holistic Health and Hormones podcast, where we explore the deeper connections between hormones, health, fertility, longevity, and mind-body connection, helping women better understand their bodies and reclaim their well-being naturally. Today's episode is one every woman needs to hear. We're diving into the topic of menopause, that transition that every woman will experience, yet so many feel completely underprepared for. From hormonal shifts, mood changes, weight gain, and fatigue to brain fog, sleep disturbances, and the emotional identity changes that can happen during this phase. Menopause is so much more than just the end of our menstrual cycles. In this episode, we're unpacking what's really happening in the body during menopause, the signs women should never ignore, how menopause impacts long-term health and longevity, and what women can do to support themselves physically, mentally, and emotionally through this transition. So whether you're approaching perimenopause or menopause, currently navigating it, or simply wanting to better understand your hormones and future health, this conversation is going to be incredibly valuable. So let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Holistic Health and Hormones podcast. Today, I'm super excited to have a dear friend of mine, Kim Collinley, who is an accredited practicing dietitian and a credentialed diabetes instructor and a member of the Australasian Menopause Society. 7 years ago, she entered menopause and experienced firsthand the frustration of brain fog, reduced cognitive ability, stubborn central weight gain, fluctuating energy and mood shifts, and the fear that this is just how it is now. That personal struggle became her mission, and Kim created the Wellness Protocol for Menopause, a targeted, evidence-based brain, bones, and body program that helps midlife women reclaim mental clarity, strong bones, and confident, vibrant bodies. She has now developed 73 Meno, a powerful new reset program specifically designed to help women 40 and over target visceral, abdominal fat, and metabolic changes that accelerate during perimenopause and menopause. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you for inviting me along. I'm excited to be here.
That's great. So awesome. We've known each other a little while, but tell everyone, I've loved the work that you've always been doing with menopause. And obviously that's the next phase of the work that I do with clients that are on that conception journey, because once they finish having children, or even those that start having children, which is more common these days in your sort of early to mid 40s, there's many more people sort of in that boat than there were a long time ago. And it's a struggle, right? And when you're sort of going through that, there is so much happening with the body, like you described a couple of those symptoms. So we'd love to have a nice long chat about sort of menopause and how that affects even sometimes the future of women's health when that is not being taken care of, sort of even well beyond, well earlier than your 40s, really, because that's when it all starts. But yeah, I'd love to hear your expertise in that. So first question, really, what led you into specializing or really looking at menopause specifically? Obviously, you went through your own, sort of menopause symptoms like every woman in their mid-40s do. So tell us a bit about all of that.
Well, I think looking back, it was actually a really interesting time because you just mentioned there, Ellie, that, women can end up having children much later. And I was one of those women. So my youngest son, who's now 18, was born when I turned 41. And so I guess I had 2 children under the age of, 3 at that point in time and 2 slightly older children. And what I didn't realize at the time was I was probably sort of postpartum, but also in perimenopause at the same time. And because you're not sleeping, because you've got young babies, and because you really don't have a lot of time to think about yourself at that point in time, I didn't realize that the weight that I was no longer able to lose was probably also this hormonal shift. And so I was storing obviously a lot of abdominal weight because you've just had a baby and you might be breastfeeding now. And that just didn't return the same way that my two previous children did. And and it wasn't until someone actually pointed this out, another health professional pointed it out and said, you could well and truly be in perimenopause at that stage and not even realize it. So there's this shift in hormones. And it was probably about nearly another decade before I went, oh, okay. So I'm nearly postmenopausal now. I went through menopause around the average age is around 51, 52, and that was me. I was in that average boat. And looking back through the lens of all of these symptoms I now had and didn't understand, I was then able to reflect that there was no clear definition, no defining break between having children and then going into perimenopause, and then not understanding what I could have done at that point in time to change the trajectory as I then went through menopause, and now I'm, nearly getting close to a decade post-menopause. So it was that lack of knowledge. No one knew. No one at that time I went through, no one was saying perimenopause. Like, no one had heard that term. And the only term we'd heard was, menopause, and that was only 12 months after the fact. All of these symptoms, like the terrible sleep, and yeah, I probably had some hot flushes. Well, I did, but they weren't all consuming. It was the sleep and then the anxiety that happened after menopause that I went, what on earth is going on? As well as the inability to really change my shape the way I used to be able to. In our 20s and 30s, we can do things and our body shape shifts really easily. And getting injured so easily. Like, I'd try and do something and then I couldn't recover. Like, it was a week or 2 weeks before that muscle stopped hurting. So it was all of these things that really made me think that surely this can't be your new life. What on earth can we do? And so it started that journey, looking more closely into what was going on, and I really wasn't very happy with what I was seeing. There was just nothing out there. No ideas as to what to do except, eat less and move more. And I went, well, how can you move more when you move and all of a sudden something really hurts? You just can't. This is not a healthy feeling like when you exercise. This is, I'm a hurt feeling when I exercise, and you can't push through that. So that's what started the journey, Ellie, and I'm very, very pleased to say there is so much you can do now that we're beginning to unravel the science.
Yeah, and the thing is, you mentioned like sort of the perimenopause, even, after children, but it must start a lot sooner. Like, just in your experience, when should women start looking? Look, I believe they should be starting to look after their hormones as young as reproduction, like, not as young as sort of as soon as they hit menarche, really, because, all of that for how your reproductive health is, would you say, sort of in your 20s, 30s, and even early 40s is sort of determining your health, hormones, and how you go through menopause, whether it is smooth sailing, because we technically shouldn't be having that sort of perimenopause stage in a way. It should be kind of smooth sailing all the way until, yeah, like you said, between 49, that's a sort of, gold textbook standard. 49 to 50 is like when you hit menopause. And then it should be maybe a couple of months, 6 months to 12 months, and then that's it, right? It shouldn't be this long-winded from perimenopause. Some people still going through menopause all the way into their 60s. They said, I've been suffering menopause for 10 years. So let's talk about defining the stage of what the perimenopause is, why we're sort of coining that term perimenopause, and why it's not just, periods, stop, and then it's menopause, and then that's it. It's just this long-winded, for some people, decade of fluctuating hormones and where that all stems from.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of things in that. The first thing you sort of mentioned was, when do you start looking after your hormones? And you're absolutely correct. It's from the beginning, when you first start in puberty. And the reason that's so important is because our ovaries are so sensitive to the environment. So if our lifestyle is poor and we've got a lot of inflammation, we're bringing a lot of toxins into the body, all of that has and stresses as well, and they're all stresses, whether nutritional deficiencies or pollutants, they all affect the inflammation within the ovary. And so we can lose function a lot sooner as a result of our environment than ever before. The potential is there. And so taking care of your lifestyle and your health as early as possible is really critical, because you don't want to end up in ovarian insufficiency in your late 20s or early 30s. And I've seen that happen. And so we need to protect the ovaries because they are so sensitive to damage. And as a result, we can lose that function much earlier than we ever thought we could. And so we want to be thinking about looking after our health very early on. When we then go into, our early 40s, and the hormones start to shift quite naturally anywhere from your late 30s through to your late 40s. That's when we have fewer eggs, that we're ovulating less. And so by the time we're 40, we've only got something like 3% of the eggs that we're born with. So as a consequence, every cycle we have is not necessarily an ovulation cycle. So we may still get a bleed, but we may not release an egg. And if you don't release an egg, you do not make progesterone. And progesterone is our anti-anxiety. It's really important for sleep, for GABA in the brain, and it works in conjunction with estrogen. So estrogen tends to turn things on, progesterone tends to dampen things down. So not every cycle is going to be an ovulatory cycle. And so the very first hormone to really get disrupted is progesterone, because of the thinning out of the eggs and not having a cycle every month. And so we can even start to get symptoms there. And even looking back in my own life, I remember the great tea incident of my early 30s, where clearly, for me, progesterone is really critical for my sleep quality. And you'll hear this when you hear about women, suffering some form of insomnia. And about 70% of women in perimenopause to menopause will experience that. And it's this 2 a.m. wakening, 3 a.m. wakening, and not being able to go back to sleep. And I had one of these events in my 30s that I distinctly remember. And I didn't drink coffee back then, but I was really a tea drinker. So not a huge amount of caffeine, but I went, oh, that tea, it's really mucked with my sleep. I'm awake at 2 a.m., can't go back to sleep. And so the next morning I got all my tea, because I love tea leaves, threw it all out on the grass and went, right, that's it. No tea anymore. I'm not disrupting my sleep. And looking back, I go, you know what? That was probably just a cycle where I didn't ovulate and there was no progesterone. And yes, caffeine, of course, can affect things, but it wasn't the root cause. And I've since go on to drink leaf tea and coffee as well now. So it just shows you how disruptive and how powerful these hormones are. And if we don't get good quality sleep, and interestingly, women are way more prone to the disruption of low sleep quality. We have a worse effect than males do. And so if we don't get good quality sleep, then that really impacts how we feel the next day, but also how much we eat, and then the insulin resistance, so driving up belly fat gain. So yes, going back to tying all that together, we want to start looking after our hormones as early as possible, because those ovaries are sensitive, and progesterone is that first hormone that disrupts, and it can be more consistently problematic in terms of symptoms in our late 30s to late 40s. And I'm not trying to frame perimenopause and menopause as a disease. It's not. It is a natural transition, but you can do it better probably than we have focused on. And I also recognize that for some women, genetics play a role where they can just have a terrible experience compared to the majority of women as well. And then some women just sail through it. So it does depend. But I think one thing to be aware of is that puberty and pregnancy are both stress tests. So, for what you may experience in perimenopause. So, for example, if you have terrible PMS or if you have postnatal depression, potentially you will see some flaring of that in the perimenopausal transition. So even just being aware means that you can get on top of things much earlier rather than just sitting back and suffering through, realizing there is so much you can actually do.
Even just for infertility, like obviously with that, if they're, you spoke about a couple of really key hormones, even progesterone, right? If they don't have enough progesterone, because like I said, most of the people trying to conceive these days are in their late 30s and early 40s, which are technically sort of going through that transition into, sort of early menopause now. And especially, like I said, the AMH, anti-Müllerian hormone, has completely significantly reduced, or it is much lower for their age than it should be. And if they've been struggling now, this is what I said, like you've got to get all your hormones fixed as early as possible, because if you've got any sort of hormonal issues and you don't address that early on, yes, infertility, but then menopause can be a real struggle for many because their hormones are all up and down. They're not having ovulatory cycles, their progesterone is super low, which impacts implantation, pregnancy. So all of that needs to be addressed, but a lot of it just gets pushed down until they're trying to conceive and they realize, I've got to get my hormones in check. And by then they're in their late 30s and early 40s. So they're fighting, the body's natural rhythm and what they've been doing for decades. And then, struggling with a lot of that, because it's much harder to treat that than when you're in your, say, late 20s or early 30s, which is like, if you want to have children, you want to go through menopause more smoothly, this needs to be addressed as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So looking at all of that, so you're not having to go through difficulty with trying to conceive and, a long-winded, sort of menopause and early egg decline, because that's just the nature. Most people are having children a lot later. And you got to know that this is what you're going to be sort of battling if you haven't been taking care of yourself early on. So let's talk about really what needs to shift and what the practical things they need to do in terms of going through a smooth, I would say having good, healthy hormones, as well as going through a sort of easier menopause transition, because there's something we do have to go through as women. But it's not the end. People, they think, oh my gosh, I'm going to perimenopause. It's the end of the world. If their parents suffered, like what have you seen in terms of correlations between if their mother went through a difficult menopause or if they've heard stories about their mum's menopause? Are they likely in the same boat? Because we know things like epigenetics and things like that. But have you seen a correlation of if your mum went through similar things and, the daughter goes through similar sort of menopause?
Certainly, we know the timing is pretty similar. So it seems to be genetically determined. And so when your mum goes through menopause, if she indeed did, and that history, then it's pretty closely tied. And I would certainly be looking at that, and because the genetics and the epigenetics are there, and be thinking, okay, if that's the trajectory my mother's taken, and there are things about that trajectory I don't like, then that's when you want to certainly be paying a lot of attention. And of course, there's a lot of chronic illness that can start to potentiate through the menopause transition. So, the risk of diabetes is higher, the risk of cardiovascular disease goes up dramatically, and women tend to be protected until menopause, and then they catch up rapidly through the menopause transition to where men are at. And of course, female specific is Alzheimer's, where 2/3 of women suffer Alzheimer's compared to men. And that's different for all the other dementias. All the other dementias are 50-50. It's quite specifically Alzheimer's that's the greater risk for women. And so now there's an interest in the perimenopause transition and looking at what's happening in the female brain through that transition. And I guess we've up until recently, we framed menopause as simply being what happens to the reproductive system, but it's not. We have estrogen receptors on every cell in the body, and so our experience of those receptors being empty, meaning there's no estrogen in them, changing the cellular function, means we can experience symptoms in every system and every cell in the body. And some of the weirdest and most wonderful symptoms of perimenopause include getting itchy ears, dry eyes, a metal taste in your mouth, or a burning when you eat hot things that you used to be able to eat chilies and things. And now that just, yes, yes, heat. Yeah, a lot more heat in the system, this inflammatory, signaling that's allowed to progress, which didn't happen before. And so there's certainly things that are happening that put us at greater risk at that point, but only if we're not actually, actively changing what we're doing so that we don't end up just falling down that same trajectory. And yeah, there's real interest now in sort of a new term to describe the menopause transition. So rather than just being a change in reproductive health, it's now considered a neuroendocrine transition, meaning that it's not just the hormonal shift, but it's actually the change of the structure in the brain as well. And so there's quite a lot of adaptations that happen in the female brain through the transition. There's a lot of pruning that happens once those hormones are no longer there. And we get the same pruning in the opposite direction in puberty. So we get the influence of hormones, which then changes the brain structure in a female compared to a male. And we get the same thing in pregnancy, where there's a change again in the brain structure. So some areas strengthen and some get pruned back. And a lot of that is to do with then how we look after our young. So, our change in temperament and the way that we connect. And that's all coming from the brain. And so this is the influence of these hormones and large volumes versus low volumes. But we also lose a lot of the energy availability in the brain. And there's some great work by Dr. Lisa Mosconi now, who's running a study, and her background is in neurology. And she's specifically looking at Alzheimer's because she has a strong genetic, link to Alzheimer's in her female part of her family. So her grandmother, her own mother, and her great aunts. So 3 out of 4 siblings were women. All 3 got Alzheimer's. The 4th one was a man and he didn't. And she went, what's going on? And so her whole research career has been looking at this link between the female hormones and the change in the brain. So she was the first scientist to think about measuring the glucose use in the brain, because the brain is heavy using glucose for function. And so she measured the brain's glucose use before menopause, and same women. So this is looking at the same women through the transition, which is really important. And so measuring women before menopause and then through menopause and post-menopause, and collecting enough data to see that on average, there's a loss of about 30% of the energy from glucose available to the brain. And that makes sense when you think about, the brain fog or the forgetting words or the slowing of the mental agility of the brain in women. And so that's the average. So there are women who do much better and there are women who do much worse. And so her current project is an international project pulling together a whole lot of researchers around the world in this space, looking at firstly looking at a marker for estrogen utilization in the brain, and then being able to track what's actually going on in the female brain and to see whether putting estrogen back in the form of menopause hormone therapy has an impact for some of the female population on their brain function as they age. So that's all being undergone now in a very rapid study to answer this question as quickly as possible, just in a 3-year turnaround. And they're sort of entering about year 2 of that, I think. So we will hopefully get a little bit more information as to whether, particularly menopause hormone therapy is protective for the female brain through this transition and beyond. It's now considered a neuroendocrine transition from fertile years to non-fertile years, rather than just focusing on the uterus and the ovaries.
Because we know that as sort of in natural medicine, which we've both been in for a long time, I mean, it's so important to address root causes. So let's talk about that. I mean, things like we know that gut health, stress, toxins, and we just mentioned a lot of inflammatory markers, metabolic markers, all of that is all going to impact how, not only for menopause, but for the rest of your longevity, for the rest of your sort of life. All of that is so important to address well before we go into those menopause years. So let's discuss a few of those sort of things. Like, we all know that is so important for just general health, because where you go through menopause is also a indication of what is happening with your hormones and overall systemic function.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no denying how powerful lifestyle factors are in this. And importantly, that is what you eat, of course. And there are changes in your body's ability to draw nutrient from food as you go through menopause itself. And that's because we have estrogen and progesterone receptors in the gut. And we also have bacteria in the gut who are responsible for breaking down estrogen that's bound. So we bind estrogen, and in the gut, they break down that binding to allow estrogen to be reabsorbed. And that group of microbes is called the estrabolome, something estrabolome. And when we stop feeding them estrogen, because we're no longer producing it, they die back. And so we get a change in the gut structure, the gut balance as well. And there are significant influences on gastric motility, so how well your bowel moves, and you can get a change in your bowel movements at that time, as well as more bloating. You become potentially more sensitive to foods that you weren't sensitive to before. So things might trigger the gut that didn't before. And the female gut is really very good up until menopause generally, dealing with infectious agents as well. So, and the whole immune system for the female is stronger typically than it is for males. And the hormones are part of that story, a big part of that story. So when those hormones go or decline, there's less protection. So you might eat something and get an infective agent, and it really can start to knock you around, whereas it didn't before. And so we see all of these shifts. At the same time, the microbes that are there become more pro-inflammatory than they used to be. So it was quite an anti-inflammatory system. And now, without estrogen in particular, we have a lot more pro-inflammatory signaling going on. And that means, and it's probably part of this link to cardiovascular health, because if you have more inflammation, you've got a lot more leakiness in the junctions in the gut. And that means a lot more potential for food allergens, so food particles, as well as what we call the LPS, the outside shell of a bacteria. So we break all these bacteria down and get rid of them through the feces, and the shells that are there are in the gut. Now, if they start leaking into the bloodstream on the other side of that gut wall, that's very, very inflammatory. And the more that gets through, the bigger the immune response. So the immune system is super targeted to those little pieces of chemical molecular structure getting into the blood. And when your immune system turns on, your energy just takes a dive. And that's what we get when, we get a virus or a bacteria and we're just, crushed for a couple of days. that's your immune system firing up and stealing the energy from the system in order to protect you now so that you live to fight another day tomorrow. So the more that you get a leakiness in the gut as your bacteria transition, the worse your energetics can be. And so, and you might even notice this after you eat. So you might eat something and the gut is naturally leaky after you eat. But if you have a large meal or something that irritates the gut, you might just feel like you have to go and fall asleep after you eat.
Yep, had that
And so,
last week. Big meal, had a buffet lunch for my husband's birthday. Oh my gosh, could not keep my eyes open half an hour later. It's right. It's a
yeah.
digestive function. You're just like, I cannot open my eyes at all.
So a
Yeah,
combination of things, the immune system kicking
yeah.
in because now you've got more rubbish in the system, but also of course if it's got a higher glucose load as well, then it can be your blood sugars as well. So we're seeing all of these shifts happen, and that is to say, we can now understand some of the symptoms we're experiencing, and that means we can do something about it. And so we can now focus on improving the microbiome. And so it becomes much more important to be including a lot more variety of plants as a big portion of our diet. And I specifically don't say fiber because we think fiber and we go, oh, well, we can just take a supplement. That's not the only purpose of eating plants, because the microbes have favorite foods and they're all different colors and they're different plants. And so if we're trying to build up what we understand to be the most important aspect of the microbiome at the moment is diversity, then we need to have different plants to feed up different species. And then those species produce chemicals that start plugging the holes in the walls of the gut. So, defending that mucosal barrier that is the major defense between our immune system and our gut. And they're back to back against, the mucosal barrier wall. And so we really need to improve the gut barrier system in order to allow the immune system to not be on such high alert. And it's no surprise that autoimmune diseases, which women are way more prone to anyway, they surface during the 3 Ps. So during puberty, during pregnancy, and during perimenopause. As those hormones start to shift, we can see that there's an elevation in potential for autoimmune. So, if you've got a family history of them, then those are the 3 periods in a woman's life where you might start to see those things happen. And there's a strong relationship between the gut microbiome and the immune system, and this is part of it. So even more important then to be looking at lifestyle, which is what you're eating, so definitely supporting the microbiome, but also then just being aware that without estrogen around, our muscle mass becomes a lot more compromised if we're not doing the right thing, because estrogen is within the muscle cell itself and it will stimulate new muscle tissue growth. So it's part of the stimulation of the stem cell, which is what we need in order to grow new muscle. And it's also part of the strength of the muscle, so the strength of the contraction. So two parts of the muscle. So we can lose volume, so that's new muscle, and we can also lose strength in the muscle. And those are certainly things that I hear a lot. So women go, yeah, I can see that my muscle mass is not there anymore and I just can't open that jar, or I can't lift that
Yeah.
bag of groceries. And so that's all part of that hormonal shift. And while you are still cycling in your 30s and 40s, that's when you really want to be building your quality of muscle and the strength in the muscle. So volume and strength. And that takes an input because it's not something that just happens, and it particularly stops happening once estrogen leaves the muscle. And even if we replace estrogen with like a hormone replacement, we really just slow the decline, and we can make a difference to our strength, but not our growth of muscle mass through that pathway. So that actually has to be done through a neurological stimulus, which is more about the type of stimulus that you get from some strength training workout. It's got to be one that actually stimulates neurologically rather than just at the muscle, because we don't have estrogen anymore to amplify a signal. Whereas in our 20s, a small stimulus created a bigger change. Now, in our 35 and beyond, when we're starting to lose a bit of that, we need to be thinking more about what is the type of movement we're doing. And we actually have to do the movement too. Just sitting back and coasting along won't protect your muscle mass. And if you don't protect your muscle, you won't protect your bone and you won't protect your brain, because when you move a muscle, you grow bone and you grow brain tissue. And so they're all connected and there's a synergy from them. So the type of exercise we do becomes important. The way we nourish the body becomes important, and we need to focus more on adequacy of protein in order to build that muscle. And a great analogy is to think of a brick wall. If you're putting up a brick wall, you need both the bricks and the mortar to build strength in that wall. And so the brick is the exercise that you do, but the cement between the bricks is the protein that you consume. And there certainly has to be a specific volume for most women to consume in order to actually put the mortar in between the bricks. And so if you're not doing both of those, you won't get the results you want. And so this is part of, the course that we built, and particularly part of 73 Meno, where we're bringing on board an exercise physiologist and an exercise chiropractor in order to really understand what is the movement, what particular movements do we need to do, and then what do we have to eat in order to get the change that we want. And so, building your muscle. And the
It's
other
different for each woman, right? I mean, it's more individualized too. I mean, we can't just go, okay, we're going to do the same thing, one size fits all, which is where a lot of the conventional medicine and just, people doing their own research instead of doing a tailored, sort of program, because we're all individual. We all experience menopause through, differently. So more of a tailored approach is going to give you the best outcome for you and your hormones.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's also understanding, what's the element within your lifestyle that's not serving you at this point in time. So, it might, for some women, it might be more gut, some it might be more brain, some it might be, the change in their body composition. So they're really gaining the belly fat. And so it's working out where the woman is and where she's at in her life. Like, does she still have small children? Is she looking after parents? And really trying to fit in the thing that's going to work the best for that woman for where she's at now. And completely agree, Ellie. It's, we'd love to be able to do everything. For those of us who want to win, we'd love to be able to do everything perfectly, but that's not life. And so it's working out which of the aspects do you need to focus on at this point in time, and then doing that to the best of your ability, and then building on another element and working out, firstly, I think it's great to have a bit of a roadmap and know all the things that we would like to be doing to maximize our health and longevity now and beyond. And that was the whole point of 73 Meno. It's it's a list of 9 things you do every day for a period of time. And then you need to work out, well, which habits do I need to continue for where I'm at now? Because you've learned about all of them. And so it's now working out, okay, well, I can't do everything still. I'm just going to focus on this for where I'm at, but I can come back to those other habits. So it's understanding that the best that we can understand the big picture of how do we live with great health for the longest possible time. And that's really, that's my focus, because that's what I want. I don't want to deteriorate. And so what do I have to do now in order to make that difference?
Where do you see conventional medicine falling short in this? I mean, we're addressing a lot of the natural things. How do you see the difference in usually when people going through menopause, they go through their GP? And, I'd love to discuss your thoughts on HRT, and the conventional sort of medicine compared to going through a more natural approach.
Yeah, so I think both. You want to know what your hormone decision is. And so you want to be able to talk to someone and go, okay, these are my risk factors. This is what's going on in my life. How symptomatic am I for the symptoms I'm getting? And then know that that's an option. And I think at this stage in time, we have not really focused. We haven't had hormones available for nearly a decade because of the Women's Health Initiative flagging estrogen as a potential for increasing breast cancer risk. And we now know that it was never the estrogen in the first place. It was the synthetic progesterone that may have given a slight increase in risk for the population of women. And so we have to sort of unravel where we've come from and now really try to understand how helpful can these hormones be. And there's science that needs to be done there. But I think the biggest issue is that women may be really suffering, and it's the hormones that are creating that suffering. And the worst suffering I feel women experience is to do with those brain changes. So really terrible anxiety or depression, and understanding that this is something that may not have been an issue before, but all of a sudden in menopause, perimenopause, it is. And recognizing that, well, this is the hormones shifting, and it's the swings, it's the highs and then the lows in the hormones that are erratic like that can really make a difference to how a woman feels. They may end up, getting PMDD just through these years and have never had it before. And that can be so destructive to a woman if she doesn't realize that she may be able to make a huge difference just by talking to a GP and getting some support with hormones. That could be enough to get her through this period of time. So I guess that was taken off the table for many women. And at the same time, what hormone therapy is evidenced for is bone density. I mean, that's where the evidence sits right now. We don't know much about the brain yet. We don't know much about the anxiety and depression side of things, although there's a clear relationship there. It's just teasing it out in the science. So it's knowing the risk benefit and having a health professional in front of you who understands the evidence to go, right now, the benefits far outweigh any risks that you might have in 10, 15 years. And so it's having that educated conversation with your GP or the endocrinologist or the gynecologist, who are all, this is all part of their wheelhouse, and being able to make the best decision for the individual in front of you. And the International Menopause Society puts out some awesome papers, and they've just released their 2026 guideline, about using hormone therapy and which, who for and when and what's the evidence, and summarizing it and what's available. And you can find that online. It's a free publication, and it's something that you can get a hold of and then take it to your GP and say, could you please, if you haven't reviewed this is the latest evidence, and then can we have a conversation, because I'm suffering. And women shouldn't have to suffer from something that, we have a fix for at the moment. At the same time, for those women who really struggle, it may not be enough with the lifestyle because they can't improve their sleep on their own. And, we know how critical sleep is, but if you can't sleep, nothing's going to change that. We can do all the lifestyle that we can, but in the end, it may not be enough. And we know how powerful those hormones are for our sleep-wake cycle as well. Progesterone and estrogen have roles to play in our sleep cycle through the phases of sleep. And so when that's all shifting and you're awake for 3 days or something really traumatic, that's not going to end well. So once again, just understanding that you can have this conversation. And even though hormone therapy may not specifically be evidence for sleep, we know through the pathways that we understand that, yeah, it may have an impact, and perhaps you can have that conversation about trying it for that, or trying it for anxiety, and just, getting the support you need, but not suffering on your own. I think then on top of that, we then need to layer in our lifestyle changes. So once you've got your hormone decision, yes or no, and also understanding there are new medications coming as well. So we've got a medication for hot flushes now, and you don't have to use hormone therapy. There are certainly new medications being developed that if you've got, a significant risk factor in your family, then you've got different options available, and they're coming. Then we've also got our lifestyle options. And so doing what we can from a nutrition perspective and from a movement perspective, so powerful, because they can make a huge difference to where you go from here. So yeah, I like women to know that they can have a conversation about hormone therapy, because so many women have been told it's not an option. It's not an option because you've got a history of, clotting. Well, go and read the latest evidence and see where that actually stands now. You've got a great aunt who's had breast cancer. Well, go and read the evidence and see where that stands now. And like I said, the International Menopause Society papers on this are really great, because they're where we're at now, and they can really inform that conversation.
Yeah, and that's so true, because you have to see what fits with your diet, lifestyle, and whether, where your hormones are sitting, so getting some good bloods done, and just what you're experiencing, because no one should be suffering, because we know how much those hot flushes can affect sleep. And if it needs to sort of transition you, I mean, there's definitely some natural remedies, but yeah, speak to your doctor and see whether it is the best option, and look at family history. But this is, like I said, starting from way earlier. Also, just a couple of things like, if you're drinking alcohol and, having a lot of spicy food and a whole bunch of things around diet, that can contribute to a lot more of those symptoms, which, like I said, if we're sort of looking at what may be the best way to cut things out naturally, so that, yeah, it is, some people may experience those transitions, but hopefully not a long-winded, sort of menopause where it drags on for so long. Like I hear women who are still suffering 10 years later, right, with hot flushes, barely
Yes.
sleeping at night. So Chinese herbs, or even if you're going down the natural route, then find a practitioner who will look at a more natural, sort of customized treatment plan for you to transition through menopause better, if you don't want to go down the HRT. Well, but
Completely agree. Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
we know that plants are so powerful. And and coming from yourself, from the Chinese plant and medical background as well, we're starting to understand just how we can use natural plants to really make a difference. And there's a synergy in this as well. So yeah, it is about getting the help that you need from someone with the experience in that space. And I think that's really important to go and continue to explore that, because we're learning so much more, and AI is really supporting that understanding, being able to understand pathways better and to understand risk benefits better from our natural plant kingdom, as much as from medications that are developed, typically from that plant kingdom as well. So that's where most of our medicine has been developed. Over 60% has come from plants.
yeah. And that's the thing, right? That's what we need if you're going to go down the natural route. There's so many things. I mean, before HRT and all of that, that's all people did in other cultures, right? We all had to go through, put people on some great formulas, and yeah, it's worked wonders, even though they've been sort of going through menopause for a long time. But how have you seen women in their 30s and early 40s? What can they sort of do now so that it can optimize both the fertility hormones and really that smooth transition into menopause and longevity? So apart from what you've spoken about, is there anything else that women in their 30s and 40s need to really be doing now to optimize that sort of, nice sort of long, healthy life where we're not going through a lot of those sort of changes, like you said, Alzheimer's, dementia, and all of that?
Yeah, I think one of the things we don't do well is measure better. So I think understanding getting blood tests done, because you might be healthy, and so no one's looked at your blood sugars, your HbA1c, which is a great indicator of where you're sitting. They haven't looked at necessarily cholesterol and particularly triglycerides, which are our circulating blood fats. So we know that through the menopause transition, those two things go up. So you get an increase in blood sugars typically, and you get an increase in triglycerides or circulating fats, as well as LDL, which is referred to as your bad cholesterol. So I think measuring what you measure, you're going to manage, and you can also see where things are trending, even if you only do it once a year. The other thing that we don't look at, and I love to send women away to do, is a DEXA scan. So the DEXA, we want to look at, what percentage fat mass is on your body and where does it sit, reference the ranges. What's your muscle mass? We'll get muscle mass. We won't get muscle quality. So we won't understand how strong that muscle is. That's a functional test, which you can similarly do. You can get an exercise physiologist, and that's their specialty, to do a functional test on you. Like, what is your walk speed? What is your how many sit to stands can you do? What's your grip strength like? So you know where you're at, and you can take these two bits of information, your functional test and your muscle mass, and go, okay, where do I sit? Reference other women. And then the other great thing that you'll get in a DEXA scan, if it's the right report that gets run, is your visceral fat. And we haven't really, I guess we haven't really identified what's going wrong as we age. We've said, if your body weight goes up, you've got a greater risk of diabetes and heart disease and Alzheimer's and cancers. We haven't really understood what's the mechanism. And the visceral fat is one of those mechanisms that has been established between the amount of visceral fat you've got and metabolic health. So anything to do with metabolic dysfunction, and arguably all of those chronic illnesses are to do with metabolic dysfunction. So visceral fat is the fat that overflows from the bathtub. If you think about, we have a certain amount of fat, which is really essential for life. And then the majority of that is stored in our hips and thighs as women, and it's estrogen that drives that. So estrogen drives the storage into subcutaneous fat. But when we lose estrogen, we don't have that same signal. And so we can store a lot more fat in the viscera. And the viscera is that part that's that storage of fat that's around the organs and in the liver and around the heart muscle. So it's kind of like it overflows out of the normal place we store fat and runs over the bathtub wall into all these other spaces where it shouldn't be. And the role of estrogen is to stop that happening. So obviously once it declines, there's more potential for that to happen. And you can be a lean person still and still have a high amount of visceral fat. And we refer to that as, skinny outside, fat on the inside, or TOFI, thin outside, fat inside. And you don't recognize that, but a DEXA scan will pick that up. So if we can do a DEXA scan and capture your visceral fat, we know what that should be, in your 30s and in your 40s. And ideally, we want to keep it around what it is potentially in our 40s and not see it expand in our 50s and 60s, because it brings risk with it. And a lot of that risk is associated with its role in inflammation. So it's not innate as a fat. It actually releases inflammatory signals. And this chronic low-grade inflammation we understand as inflammaging. So we see it as we age, the whole system is more inflamed, and that shows up in all sorts of ways like puffiness and water weight and hurting. And so we know that the visceral fat has a role to play in this. And that's why we use waist circumference as, one of our metrics as well. Although, like I said, we don't always see it because it can build before our waist really packs on. But obviously putting on belly fat is one of the iconic signs of menopause itself as well. And we know that that's an increase in visceral fat. And we now know that you can maintain your weight through menopause and still increase your visceral fat and lose your muscle mass and lose bone, because body weight is all of those things. It's muscle, bone, and fat mass. And so, it was a great study who looked similarly at the same woman through menopause and saw this increase in, these changes. So it was observing the changes in the type of fat there was and the volume of fat, and also the change in muscle mass, and was able to see that even if you don't gain weight, you can still increase your visceral fat, which then brings the diabetes risk, particularly in the heart disease risk. So, so doing a DEXA scan is one of my favorite things to suggest to women, because what you measure, you're going to manage. And then the last bit of that scan is just a little bit of a snapshot of your bone health. So it's only giving you a snapshot. It can't be used as a diagnostic tool. You need to go and do the exact same scan, but with a different report for bone density. So it's the same machine that does our bone density scans, and a proper bone density can be used diagnostically for osteopenia, which is reduced bone mass, and then osteoporosis. And I have seen, a colleague of mine was in her early, sort of late 40s, early 50s, and she was out walking her dog one day, and she's an avid hiker, so she does lots of hiking and was very active, and was out walking her dog, and a dog came bounding out and knocked her over, and she broke bones, and went and had a bone density done, because that shouldn't happen. And her T-score, which is that measure of bone density, was -3. And she wasn't even through menopause at that point in time. You don't want to have that happen. You don't want to find out you've got no bone or insufficient bone left, because at that point in time, you don't have the same volume of hormones. And she's now on hormone therapy, which will mitigate some of that risk moving forward. But you want to be in your 30s and find out your bone density is not ideal, not in your 50s, because in your 30s you can do so much. And we know the type of movement, and we know what can help from a diet perspective to really make a difference to your bone health. And most women aren't aware that their peak bone mass is going to happen by about the age of 20 for women, and by 35 they're starting to lose bone mass. So if you never get to your peak, and that can happen for lots of reasons. So smoking, if you smoke in your teenage years, you won't hit peak bone mass for you. It can happen through use of steroid medication like asthma puffers and things. It can happen through, not eating enough. So just having a really small appetite and just always being undernourished because you don't have a big appetite. It can happen through women in sport who really train hard but don't have enough nutrition to both make a muscle change as well as recover the body. So there are lots of reasons where we may not hit that peak bone mass. And then as our hormones start to decline in our 30s, that can be the difference. But if we measured early enough, we would know that, and we could make a difference. Like, we've got 10, 15, 20 years then to make a difference. But we have to measure, and you can go and measure your bone density. You can do a bone density anytime. You have to just go and ask your doctor for a referral. You're not going to get compensated for it, but it's not that expensive a test that you can't do it. But it's also why I like to do a DEXA scan, because it'll give you a little bit of insight into where your bone's at. So if you see a negative score on a DEXA scan, that's a reason to take that into your doctor and say, maybe I should have a look at this bone density, because I'm not sure that's a great place to be at. And so those 3 compartments are really valuable, plus your blood test results. You're starting to see a picture of what you're like on the inside, and you can't always see that from the outside. So they're the big things for me. What we measure, we'll manage, and we're going to get better at it because there's newer technologies.
There is. It's getting cheaper and there's so
Yeah.
much. Like with so many different functional tests, I mean, there's no excuse. We can't just sit in the dark. And then when things happen, like I said, we should be looking at these in our early 30s and not in our late 40s, early 50s.
Yep.
For sure.
Prevention
Yeah.
rather than responding. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, Kim, like what does a truly healthy, empowered menopausal woman look like and feel like to you?
Well, I think the word we like to use now is strong. So mentally and physically strong. And both of those require input, becoming mentally strong. And something we haven't mentioned is this pruning that happens in menopause for women has a very positive effect on becoming a stronger woman. And so the pruning that happens when we come out the other side seems to show up as a more resilient, stronger person through those brain changes. So it's not all negative with, not having as much energy in the brain and such. And that is, for most women, largely transitory. It's just this group of women for whom it's not and continues that we want to be able to assist. But stronger brain, so being more resilient and solving problems and being able to be a force in the world. And then a stronger body to support that as well. So strong bones, strong muscles. Gone are the days of this, this thin look that has dominated our culture for a long time. Now it's healthy and strong at any size. And when we think about the things that we want to do now, it's all about nourishing our brains and our bodies and growing stronger as we age so that we can do more with our life, because it's only, one stage of our life is complete, but there's another stage to come, and it's a very important stage for people and for humanity to have strong women.
Amazing, Kim. Well said. And for those who want to connect with Kim, I'll post her links in the chat so you can connect with her if you're going through menopause and would love to get her help to transition to being healthy, strong, empowered women. Thank you so much for your expertise and, all your great advice for the women who are going through perimenopause and menopause.
Thank you, Ellie. It was so lovely to be able to chat and to reconnect with you.
Amazing. All right. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of the Holistic Health and Hormones podcast. I hope this conversation helped you feel more informed, empowered, and reassured about menopause and the changes women experience through this transition. One of the biggest takeaways from today is that menopause is not something women simply have to survive, that with the right support, education, holistic approaches, it can be a powerful opportunity to reconnect with your health and well-being. If this episode resonated with you, please make sure you subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear this conversation. And if you'd like support with your own hormones, health, fertility, or overall well-being, you can find more information in my links below. And thank you again for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.